Yes. Hey, good morning, guys. Welcome to Sunday morning. It's windy out here. Moved up my microphone, hoping that you'll be able to hear me better. But I didn't want to not do the broadcast today because I missed last week. I had a bicycle race. So I'm so happy to be with you again this Sunday morning. And we're doing a series called Exodus Through Ancient Eyes. And we've gone as far as two visits or two meetings between Moses, Aaron, and the Pharaoh of Egypt. And today we'll be focusing on the plagues. Right, so last week we mentioned that the plagues are mentioned in three places in the Bible, and unfortunately, they don't really mention all the same plagues. There's not 10, for instance, when we go to the Psalms. So we have different versions of the story, and one of the things that this raises with scholars is how historical is this really? Now, as we've mentioned before, we do believe that there's some form of historical root, but it does seem that the oral tradition that eventually gets written down about 700 years later has a lot of literary edges to it, which gives us the idea that it's, in some forms, it's supposed to be prose, but it actually reads like poetry. And this means either one or two things, kind of like, either Moses was writing in a language that would only exist 600 years later, and he was an excellent poet, which that kind of scholars reject that type of view. A much more likely scenario is that by the time the elite scholars of Israel, by the time they write down these stories for us, the stories have been shaped, they've come through a lot of oral transmission. And eventually, when the final redactors put them together, they kind of use a lot of literary tropes, literary devices, poetic language to put the story together for us. This is one of the indicators that what we're really dealing with here is not really so much an exact historical account, but we are more dealing with as we've said before, mythicized history. In other words, something occurred, but the version we have seems to be embellished with mythic ideas. Now, what does mythic ideas mean? It doesn't mean nonsense, made up ideas. Mythic ideas means that the story is told through the lens of something that is much larger than the story itself. And that mythic lens for Exodus seems to be a cosmic battle between God and the gods of the Egyptians, a proxy war between Moses that is fought. Woo, we got wind. A proxy war that is fought between Moses and Pharaoh. Right. So today I've got the dogs barking at me here. I hope they'll get quiet very soon. I hope one of my family members will come and rescue me here. Otherwise, just please ignore them. So today we're dealing with the plagues. And we want to have a look at the literary structure of the plague. So it just so turns out that normally when you write just pure history, you don't find strong literary structure. But what we do find in the Exodus plagues are, in fact, very strong literary structures for the plagues. And that's what we want to deal with today. Right, so the plagues in Exodus are actually, there's 10 of them, of course, as you know, but there seems to be 3 cycles of 3, and then the final death of the firstborn, the main one, right? So in these 3 cycles of 3, it seems like each one of the cycles follow the same pattern as the next 3, And of course, if you're a Bible reader or just a student of ancient works, you realize that a pattern of 3 threes is a very powerful pattern, especially in ancient Jewish literature. Threes are the excellent way, I think, as Proverbs would sometimes translate it. God does things in threes. We look at the imagery in the tabernacle. There's 3 spaces, etc., etc. The third day is a very significant day for ancient Israelites. And so when we engage the plagues and we see that there's 3 cycles, and in each of these cycles, there's 3 plagues, that immediately, gives us an idea. Whoa, hold on, what are we dealing with here? So just let's have a look at this. Let me just name them for you before we get going. So in the first cycle, we have the first plague of the blood, the waters turning into blood. Then the second plague is that of the frogs, and the third plague is that of the gnats, right? Then we move on to the second cycle, and these are in chronological order according to Exodus. In the second cycle, we have firstly the flies, and secondly, we have the livestock, and then lastly, we have the boils, right? And then we go into the third cycle, and there are 3 plagues in there again. The hail, number 7, number 8, the locusts, and number 9, the darkness on the earth. And when these 3 cycles, which seem to build up steam and build up weight, and the latter ones start to affect the Egyptian people directly, not just their land, their resources, or their livestock. Eventually, we end with the grand finale, which is the death of the firstborn, which is a terrible thing that has happened to them. The idea of the firstborn dying is really something that ancient humans, it was quite an established type of idea that whatever is first belongs to the gods. The idea, for instance, of first fruits, which we read about in the scriptures, which seem to be introduced by Moses, is really something we could also find in other cultures much older than the Jewish culture. Right. So let's have a look now at each one of these 3 cycles. And what we will find that in each of these 3 cycles, there are 3 plagues. And for some reason, there are patterns that in each cycle are exactly the same. For instance, for each of the first 3 cycles, there's the forewarning is given for the first 2 plagues in that cycle, but no warning is given for the 3rd plague. Okay, so just to be clear, just make sure I'm expressing myself properly and that you understand what I'm saying is, there are 3 cycles. In each of the cycles, there's 3 plagues. Now, when we go to the first cycle, we find that the first 2 plagues in that cycle has a forewarning that's given, but the last one has no forewarning. But this is also then true of cycle 2. The first 2 plagues get a forewarning, and the last plague, there's no forewarning. This is also true of cycle number 3. The first 2 plagues get a forewarning, and the final one doesn't. Very, very strong rhythmic literary pattern, structured in the way that the plagues are given, in the way that the events around the plagues, for instance, in the forewarnings, are structured and written down. Okay, so that's the first pattern we pick up. First 2 plagues, forewarnings. The final plague has no forewarning. Right, the second pattern we pick up is that in these forewarnings, the forewarning for the first plague in each cycle is given in the morning. Right? For the second plague, there's no information about the forewarning that is given. And in the third, and for the third plague in each cycle, of course, there's no forewarning. Now, this happens the same for each one of these cycles 3 times. Right? Second pattern that we can identify. The final pattern that we can identify is that the instruction to Moses for the first plague in each cycle is you have to go and present yourself, right? So he goes to Pharaoh and he presents himself. This type of forewarning or this type of instruction is only given for the first plague in each of the 3 cycles. For the second plague in each cycle, the words are go to Pharaoh, right? So there's and I'm quoting verbatim, the point of that being the exact same terms are used for the first plagues, the exact same terms are used for the second plagues when it touches the instruction given to Moses. And then for the third plague, as we've seen in each cycle, there is no instruction given. So this is a rather clear literary pattern that we find in the way that the plagues are structured, in the way that the plagues are forewarned, and in the way that Moses is given instruction as to what to do before each of these plagues. So we're dealing with, when we read something like this and we become aware of the patterns, we realize that we might be dealing with poetry. In the one extreme, this might just be like literally a poem. Secondly, it could be history that poetry has been written about. And so we're not always sure exactly what this means, but one thing we do know is that we're not reading straightforward history. That's not what we're reading here. There's something else going on. It raises, obviously, the question on whether the whole story in the one extreme was just created out of nothing, right, and written in poetic story form. But the question, of course, is Why does the writer create the pattern in the first place? Why would a writer write something in this type of strong literary pattern? Now, we find that it is quite common in folklore for things to happen in threes, of course, as I've mentioned previously. And the reason for this is to intensify the story towards a climax. So you have 3 cycles of 3, and you have an intensification, which we'll speak about in a moment, in the plagues as they go forward. So it seems like one of the reasons why a writer would use this pattern is to build the readers up into a great climax, which seems to be this final plague, which of course a devastating, I'm not sure if we can call that a plague, but a devastating occurrence, which is the killing of all the firstborn children and the firstborn of all the livestock, of course, in the land of Egypt. So it seems like each of the cycles progressively increase the intensity. Each of the cycles start, for instance, with Pharaoh is given a forewarning in the morning. Moses goes out, presents himself before Pharaoh. Pharaoh gets that warning, right? And but the second plague of each cycle happens quickly. There's no forewarning. It just happens quickly. The scene is set almost immediately after the first one, right on the heels of the first plague. So within each cycle, the plagues also get more and more intense, right? The cycle as a whole become more and more intense also as we move forward. For example, in plagues 1 and 2, Pharaoh's magicians can replicate the plagues produced by Moses' God, which is a really interesting thing, like that the writers would include this. But the magicians of Pharaoh, they can do the same thing. The first 2, of course, is blood, turning water into blood and making frogs appear. So it seems like the Egyptian musicians can do the same thing. And it is also maybe not a coincidence at all, and we'll speak about that in a moment, that the Nile and the frogs are very dear to the gods of the Egyptians. We'll mention that a little bit later. Possibly that is why they could produce some form of magic around these plagues. But anyway, plague 1 and 2, the Egyptian pharaohs the magicians seem to be able to replicate the plagues, but after that, they can't, right? And so this seems to be a build-up in tension. Also, Pharaoh begs Moses to make plagues 2, 4, and 7. Now, as you'll do your maths there, 2, 4, and 7 is the second plague of each of the 3 cycles. And after each of these plagues, Pharaoh begs Moses and says, please, can you make this stop? But then has a sudden change of heart. So this happens after the second plague in each cycle. So as you can see, there's many layers to these patterns, but it becomes quite obvious that the 10 plagues are not just written as it happened. They are structured in a literary form, and so they are delivered to the readers. By the time we get to plagues 8, 9, and 10, which is the final cycle, Pharaoh seems to be completely convinced that he does not stand a chance, and he completely caves in. God's power and Pharaoh's weakness are made more apparent as we move through the plagues. Note also that the 6th plague, that of the boils, that's the point at which these plagues move off the land, off resources, and off livestock, and actually starts affecting the Egyptian people themselves. So that's also an escalation that takes place, because the plagues before that kind of just targeted the Egyptians indirectly. All right, so the point is that the whole thing is very structured. We're dealing with a literary creation and not just a reporting of facts. And this seems to be pretty obvious. And so the question just remains then for us as modern people, so far removed from the reported events and also so far removed from the time in which they were actually reported and written down for us. How much of this is historical? How much of this is just theological writing? How much of this is just literary creation to deliver a theological message about the God of Israel? The point is that the historicity of the story is placed in question by the text itself. The story itself shows us that it's not just plain narrative or plain history. We're dealing with some form of interpretation, translation, some form of poetry of the actual events that the writers are seemingly reporting. Right. So many fundamentalist interpreters continue to try and prove the historicity of the plagues. I don't know how you would prove that something happened. How many years ago are we talking about? 2000 plus another 1, 3. So 3,300 years ago. Like, how would you prove this? Like, it's basically impossible. But a lot of fundamentalist interpreters have spent a lot of time to prove that, well, these things could actually have happened as natural disasters or natural phenomena of that region. Such a claim would be, for example, that the Nile could have turned red due to the presence of a kind of an algae, right? But one must think that this type of reasoning, that the plagues were natural disasters, if I can just use a generalization like that, seems to be self-defeating. Because the biblical writers are actually trying to make the point that these are not natural disasters, but a direct action of Yahweh on his enemies. And so to argue that they were natural disasters seems to negate the point that the writer is trying to make in the first place. So it's not really an option for serious scholars to try and prove that these were natural disasters. Anyway, fixating ourselves on what actually happened historically is going to prevent us from understanding what claim the writers are trying to make. And so that's not what we want to do from here on. We don't want to try and say, was it historical or wasn't it? We want to say that we really don't know. It seems like we're dealing with some form of poetry. But let's focus on what is the point, Exodus through ancient eyes. What would be the point that the writers of Exodus are trying to make to the ancient readers? And this seems to be the point that Yahweh, the creator of the cosmos, has now come, and he has come to set his people free. That seems to be the point of this portion. Yahweh is the master of the cosmos. He is the creator God, according to the Israelites. And he has now come, and he has come to use his power. And you can see as he is able to affect natural phenomena directly, that he truly is who he says he is to these Israelites. That's the point he's trying to make, that he is the God of the created order of the cosmos, and that nature will do his bidding when he feels so, or when he wants to show it in this way. Something else we'd like to focus on today is that we have here also something we mentioned, a concept we mentioned a little bit earlier on, is the pattern of chaos and order. We spent a bit of time in Genesis, and maybe that is good for us just to do a quick recap then of Genesis. The plagues are not just random disasters of divine muscle flexing, but they seem to be deliberate demonstrations by God, by Yahweh, of his control over every element in the cosmos. Creatures, the elements themselves, heavenly bodies, death itself, life itself, everything. So let's have a quick recap of Genesis. In Genesis 1, God comes to the chaotic earth with chaotic waters, and he starts to create order from the chaos that is present in it. And so, of course, we have our other early creation or origin myths. For instance, the Babylonians we start with the same type of thing. We start with a dark, chaotic water type of situation, and order then flows from that. Of course, in these other myths, violence is a huge part of how order is created, and that's something that's really special about the biblical narrative, is no violence is involved in moving from in moving from chaos to order. And this seems to be actually very, very important to the writers, to the ancients, but also to us today to see that difference. But anyway, in Genesis, the scene opens with darkness and the deep, the chaotic waters. These two entities, they stand in the way of God creating space and order for the living things that he wants to bring into being. So the Creator then starts to order the chaos, and he starts to put order in these spaces. He starts by breaking darkness away from light, bringing separation. He also separates the waters so that there is water above and water below, and there's a firmament that now creates space for all living beings. So he creates spaces. He's creating order out of the chaos. The waters below are separated, and they separate, I guess, horizontally to produce dry land. And this will be the place where animals and humans will be able to walk. So in the first 3 days, from days 1 to 3, so days 1 to 3 provide the form, and days 4 to 6 will start to fill that form. These are, of course, the 6 creation days we read about in Genesis. God starts to speak bodies into being, and that they will start to fill the created space. As we have said previously, and you might know that this is also a beautiful literary pattern that we find in Genesis. Also, one of the ways that we suspect we're not dealing here with actual historical events, but we're really dealing in a representative case, a poetic case. So the light is created on day 1 and is then later filled with the sun, moon, and the stars. The sky and the sea below is created on day 2. Later it's filled with birds and sea animals. The dry land will be filled with animals, and then of course finally humans. This very orderly act of formation or creation is pronounced to be very good at the end of the 6th day, as Israel's God creates the cosmos by ordering it and putting it in place. For this reason, God is depicted as truly as the supreme deity, over and above all other gods of other nations, and that includes the gods of Egypt. Remember that Genesis and Exodus are put in their final redacted form, not 2,600 years apart, but really kind of in the same time by the same group of elite scribes. So we can expect that these things tie into one another, and this is actually the point that's made by Professor Pete Innes about Exodus, is that it very closely, or let me put it this way, it is supposed to be read in light of Genesis, because the same God that ordered the cosmos and then will be the same God that will later come to the Egyptians and be able to reintroduce chaos to the order and then take that chaos back. In other words, the plague is actually a temporary reintroduction of absolute chaos in the order, and then God can give it, he can create the chaos, but he can also pull the chaos away again. And this is a way in which the writers are drawing our attention that this is in fact the Creator God that is able to do all of these things. Right. You will remember that in Genesis 6, for instance, after in Genesis 1 and 2, everything is good and great, creation kind of stumbles into a form of chaos, or let me rather say a form of violence, where all the earth is filled with violence. God regrets that he has made them, and God reintroduces the chaotic waters. He opens up the floodgates of heaven, and the waters from the deep come up the springs, and he kind of collapses, or according to the writers, he kind of collapses that order back into chaos. But his group, his ark-dwelling Noah and his family, they are saved. They are saved from the chaos God introduced temporarily. And then after, depending on which version you read, 40 days or 150 days, God retracts the chaos and order returns, and Noah can start afresh. So what we already have in Genesis 6 is an incident or a case where God temporarily introduces back chaos and then pulls it back to form order. And so what is suggested here is that the plagues are kind of just that same thing again. God temporarily interjects, produces chaos by showing his power over elements, etc., etc., creates chaos. The Egyptians suffer, but the Israelites are saved in the same way that Noah and the ark are saved. They are protected if they obey, like if they listen to the instructions. Of course, the final plague there's an instruction. And if you don't follow it, you die with everybody else. But the plagues are exactly this thing, a temporary introduction of chaos back into the world, which God instigates and pulls back again, destroying his enemies, their land, their crops, sometimes their children, but his people are protected in an ark. So that's just a way that we can see how these narratives and this idea about God, creator of order and chaos when he needs to, kind of weave together when we come to the plagues. Right, now, like the flood of Noah, each plague is a little pocket of chaos. The created order goes berserk for a small time, then order is restored, but crucially God's people, they are protected if they follow the rules, of course. And you will recall that when Moses is on his way to Egypt, back into Egypt for the first time, God attacks his son in the middle of the night because he's not circumcised. And so the point seems to be made that, look, you're not special. If you don't follow the rules, you'll die as well. And so the rules need to be followed. Right. We will see this principle play out again in the Red Sea crossing. Think about the Red Sea crossing again as waters collapsing in chaos on God's enemies, but the Israelites are saved. It's kind of it's very reminiscent of the flood account, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But the point is just that to realize that these things kind of do take hands in the way that ancient readers would have understood them. Right. So the plagues, the Red Sea event, they're all supposed to be read in light of each other, together with the ideas that are put forth in the creation account. It helps to interpret each other. And as we will see, the story of the tabernacle later on, again, the story of the tabernacle dominates the last 16 chapters of Exodus, seems to again pay tribute to this creation theme. Now, if we miss how the plagues are tied to these other stories, they will just look like bizarre science fiction fairy tales to modern readers. But if we realize that the plagues tie in to the general narrative, even from Genesis, that they are the introduction of chaos and the restoration of order, we will then start to be able to see how an ancient reader would have wrapped his mind around these things. The Creator is on the move again. Pharaoh and the gods that back him are in serious trouble with the supreme Creator God. That's the point of Exodus. That's the point of the plagues, at least at this point. Now we're going to introduce the concept of the cosmic battle. Right, so cosmic battle meaning simply a battle between the gods. Now, for most modern Christian readers, when we read Exodus, we don't really see it as a battle between the gods, because we believe, many of us, I myself, we believe that the ancient Israelites just didn't believe in other gods, and even the literati who would have written down these accounts would not have been polytheists, but they would have believed in one God. So to think even that they would write this account in light of the battle of the gods would be nonsensical to modern Christians who haven't done their homework. Now, once you do your homework, you will realize that the ancient Israelites were basically polytheists, and that the only difference between them and the general polytheism of the time is that they did not worship the other gods. Well, they did from time to time, and that's why half the Old Testament is about how they shouldn't. But they believed that their God, Yahweh, was the Most High God, right? Meaning the God above all the gods. And we're gonna walk through a couple of things here to show that Israel really were not, definitely not monotheists in the time that these were written, at the time that these accounts were written, but at the same time, not completely polytheists. So there's a word for this. It's called monolatrism, I think it's called, or henotheism. There's two words. But it basically just means that you're not a monotheist, which means you believe that there are many gods, but there's only one God that you need to serve. And for the Israelites, that was, of course, Yahweh. All right, sorry. The question is there another lens that we could view the plagues through that will make more sense? My word. We've got some gusts going here today. My timing's really bad. Is there another lens? Let's just wait for this guy to finish up here. I feel like I'm screaming. Is there another lens that we could view the plagues through that will make more sense than the traditional lens of trying to force all of these events into actual historical events? Now, here scholars believe today that they have such a lens. It is the lens of mythicized history. This means the account of the plagues are told in terms of a greater cosmic theological reality. That's the mythic element to the story. The mythic element is predominantly displayed in Exodus 2, verse 12. Now, this is a portion you might have read many times, but you've never really knew what to do with it, maybe like me. But I'm going to read it for you now. This passage describes the 10th plague while setting us up for the Passover. The cosmic dimension of the drama is on full display here in Exodus 12, verse 12. Here we go. This is God speaking. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals, semicolon. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. All right. So maybe previously you would have just read over that and thought, oh, I'm not sure what's going on here, but let's just carry on. You know, it's metaphoric or whatever. But I think here is a very clear indication here in the climax really of the plagues is the death of the firstborn. And here in the climax of the plagues, the real intention or the mythic element to this story is revealed to the reader. On all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. Right? So it seems, reading this simply, Yahweh sets his sight not on the political power of Egypt, no, but on the gods that back it. Now, this passage only makes sense if we accept that the Israelites assumed that there were many gods among the nations. And to free the Israelites, Yahweh must also subdue the Egyptian gods. Now, this would have been a very common type of viewpoint in the ancient world. If your army, let's go to the battlefield, your nation's army were to beat the nation's army next door to you, firstly, that would mean that the God that backs your army would have to be stronger than the God that backs their army. And so it really was always thought of in some sense as a proxy war between the gods. The gods are really fighting. And then what would often happen is that if you lost, you would kind of take on that other god and start worshiping him because he's the stronger one. You want the stronger one in your corner. And often this is the way that gods were accepted and, what's the right word, synchronized almost throughout the ancient, at least the Mesopotamian area. So anyway, it seems like in the historical context, this is exactly what we're dealing with here from the writer's point of view. They really believe that this is a battle between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, which is a war that is being fought proxy, I don't know what the right English word is, but it's a proxy war through Moses and Pharaoh, or the Israelites and the Egyptians. But ultimately, the mythic element, the God element of the story is Yahweh is fighting the Egyptian gods. Now, you must remember, these Egyptian gods are ancient. It is no wonder that Pharaoh, when Moses arrived at first, said to Moses, never heard of your God. I've been serving mine for very long, and I'm the most powerful man in the world at the moment. So, you know, Why should I be afraid? My God's been backing me all the way along. You're a bunch of slaves, so I'm not interested. All right. So Yahweh doesn't set his side on political power. This is about the battle. This seems to be the reality of the ancient Israelites. Now, that might sound strange to modern conservative Christian ears, but the Israelite writers really don't care about what we think today and how we would perceive it today. This was their reality. These stories were written by and for ancient Israelites, who most certainly believed that other gods existed and that Yahweh was the Most High God. Now, if you read the account in Psalm 78, twice in verse 35 and 56, you will read the High God or the Most High God being Yahweh. And so this seems to be their view. Now, Psalm 95 verse 3 will call him the great king above all the gods. Now, it's impossible to read this and make this, it doesn't, these portions don't make sense unless this was their reality. Let me give you a couple of other places in Exodus where there seems to be evidence that the Israelites believed in other gods. Now, this is, we're just going to be dealing with Exodus and possibly just a portion from Psalms. Let me say from the outset that later on in Israelite life, the later prophetic scriptures, yes, they do condemn the type of, or they have a much stronger monotheistic thrust. And we know that Judaism ends up in strict monotheism, and that's where we as Christians also get our monotheistic thrust from. But it's not the way it started out initially. For instance, Exodus 15:11. Who is like unto thee, O Lord, amongst the gods? All right. Exodus 18:11. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Now, even if you say, France, the Bible doesn't believe there's many other gods. Fine. But the Israelites did. They did. That's why they wrote these things. Exodus 20 verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. This is not the way you write when there are no other gods. You would have said, I am the only one that exists. This, of course, is part of the Ten Commandments. Psalm 82, famous one, verse 1. God stands in the congregation of the gods, or the mighty. He judges amongst the gods. All right, so don't want to go too much into this, but it's quite obvious to most scholars that these early Israelites believed in other gods, and that the Exodus account seems to be a story that at its highest level, its mythic level, it's God fighting the gods of the Egyptians. With only a very few possible exceptions, as we said, some of the later prophetic works, the Old Testament, here we go, like a strong gust again. Let me just give it a moment. Right, that's right. With only a few possible exceptions, the Old Testament portrays the Israelites as assuming the existence of other gods, though they were commanded to only worship Yahweh, their creator and their deliverer. This was the first of the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other God before me, no other gods before me, as opposed to no other gods exist except me. If you miss this, you're going to miss the theology, the mythical part of the Exodus story. So I have a side note here, and I just want to read it for you, although I have touched on this. Most scholars believe the Israelites were mostly polytheistic. Like, for instance, case in point, Solomon, their beloved king during the First Temple period. Due to, for instance, the archaeological evidence we have of multiple idols found in and around Jerusalem during the pre-exilic period, as much to as my knowledge goes, 1 to 2 per household. That's a lot. And that it was only after the exile that there was strong monotheistic thrust within the nation that was characterized by the Hebrew scriptures that were starting to call out the polytheism amongst the people. So the theology of Exodus centers in a cosmic battle between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, and the proxy war is fought through Moses and Pharaoh. On the one side, we have the mighty Egypt, the superpower of the ancient world, backed by their ancient powerful gods and represented by the mighty Pharaoh. And on the other side, we have a newcomer God, Yahweh, who Pharaoh's never heard of, the God of the slaves, represented by Moses. When we read Exodus 12:12, as quoted a little bit earlier, we realize what's been happening all along in the Exodus account. Several of the plagues also seem to be direct attacks on Egyptian gods. Let's use an example. The very first plague of blood in the Nile. Now, the Nile along with all the water of Egypt is turned into blood. Besides making the water undrinkable, it's going to put Hapi, the Nile deity, in a really, really awkward position. This deity, Hapi, Egyptian god, he oversaw the yearly inundation of the Nile. This is when the Nile would breach its banks and what's the right word? I forgot the English word for making the land wet, not fertilize. Anyway, making, I forgot that one. But anyway, this inundation of the Nile, in which the water would break the banks of the Nile, was absolutely crucial for life in Egypt. It would water all the crops and make sure that the Egyptians could continue to have food, basically, in Egypt, right? Guys, I really chose a good day out here. So, this deity Hapi, he actually oversees the annual flooding of the Nile, or the inundation of the Nile. And as it is vital for the existence of Egypt, turning the water into blood is really embarrassing. And it's not only payback for the slaying of the male Israelite infants that were thrown into the Nile, but it also symbolizes a humiliation, a nullifying, if you will, even a slaying of the god Hapi. You can imagine what would happen in Egypt when the Nile turns to blood on command of Moses. Everyone is praying to Hapi, what's going on? What's going on? Hapi can't do anything. Hapi can't reverse it. Only the God of Moses can reverse it. And so here is an indirect story of Yahweh fighting these gods. The second plague is, of course, the multiplication of the frogs in Egypt, which again is hardly random. The Egyptian goddess of fertility, Heket, was depicted with the head of a frog. She became also associated with the annual flooding of the Nile, but also with fertility and actual childbirth. The issue at hand is, who is in control of fertility? Is it Heket or is it Yahweh? And the story makes the point clear. Yahweh is in control of the frogs. Yahweh is in control of fertility. Of course, fertility is extremely important in the ancient world. Many of the gods of ancient Mesopotamian or the ancient Near East were fertility gods for that reason. Fertility was important not only for humans, but livestock, agriculture, etc. Whoever controlled fertility really controlled everything concerning the existence of a people. So the first two plagues are very hard stabs at the heart of the Egyptian existence, but also at the Egyptian gods. And this no-name god that Pharaoh had never heard of was trumping his gods and causing chaos in Egypt. When we think back on the staff of Aaron that became a snake and ate the snakes of Egypt, the Egyptian musicians' snakes, we should have known all along. Pharaoh should have known, but of course he didn't. The last two plagues give us a peer into the cosmic dimension of this battle. For instance, the ninth plague. In the ninth plague, the sun is blotted out. Now, it just so happens, and most of you might know this, that the sun god Ra was the god that personally backed Pharaoh. The sun god Ra was worshipped as the creator god. I know that during the 14th century BC, there was a pharaoh, I think his name was Atenaken, if I'm not mistaken, and he actually tried to turn Egypt into a monotheistic society and placed one god, the sun god, as the one and only god. But when he died, they flipped everything back into polytheism. But anyway, Ra was the creator god of the Egyptians, the principal god. And at some stages, he was even called the king of the gods. And when Yahweh blots out the sun, he is slaying, humiliating, and he is neutralizing the Egyptian creator god and their giver of life. Yahweh alone is creator, giver of all life, and the most high God. Finally, in the 10th plague, the most devastating of all, it seems like the killing of the firstborn in Egypt, right? The Egyptian god who controls death was called Osiris. And he was worshipped as the judge and lord of the dead and the underworld. These gods were ancient. They were being worshipped by this stage for over 1,000 years already. What could a newcomer like Yahweh do against them? It turns out a lot. Yahweh shows his control of death by killing the firstborn sons in Egypt, the progenitors of the families and the dynasties. Where is Osiris? And why can't he prevent the death of the Egyptians? And why can't he create the death of the Israelites? Truly, Yahweh is in control of death. This is the point of the story of Exodus. To be clear, nobody believes that these gods are actually in control of these aspects of fertility, life, death, etc. But these stories were shaped by a world that accepted these things as true. This was their reality, an active and a populated divine realm. And however much we might dismiss the mythic nature of these stories, it is precisely their mythic content that would have spoken so loudly to an ancient people. The battle of the gods is about to come to a climactic end in the chase that ends in the Red Sea. But first, we need to linger a little bit longer at the 10th plague, and that's what we will do next time. Thank you so much for being with me today. I'll see you next Sunday. Cheers.